What happens when a band spends years trying to find its place in heavy metal, and just when it seems like they finally know who they are, the entire musical landscape changes around them? For Flotsam and Jetsam, that moment came in 1995. The band that had once been associated with the explosive thrash metal of Doomsday for Deceiver and No Place for Disgrace had already undergone several transformations. When the Storm Comes Down had shown the first signs of change, while 1992's Cuatro pushed the band further toward a more mature and controlled sound. But on their fifth album, Drift, Flotsam and Jetsam didn't simply evolve. They almost became a different band. Released on April 25th, 1995, Drift would be the final album of the band's three-record relationship with MCA. It would also become one of the most controversial albums in their catalog. Some fans saw it as a bold experiment that showed the band refusing to repeat itself. Others saw it as a band abandoning the sound that had made them special in the first place. And looking back today, Drift may be one of the most interesting albums in the entire Flotsam and Jetsam story. One of the interesting things about Drift is that despite all the changes happening around the band, the lineup itself was remarkably stable. Eric A.K. was still behind the microphone, with Ed Carlson and Michael Gilbert handling the guitars, Jason Ward on bass, and Kelly David Smith behind the drums. This was the same lineup that had recorded Cuatro, and that stability mattered. For a band that had already dealt with the departure of important members, including Jason Newsted years earlier, having the same five musicians together gave Flotsam and Jetsam an opportunity to develop their chemistry. The previous album, Cuatro, had already demonstrated that they weren't interested in simply recreating their 1980s sound. Producer Neil Kernan returned for Drift, and the band continued exploring the possibilities that had opened up during the previous recording. The album was recorded during 1994 and 1995 at Village Productions in Tornillo, Texas, with Kernan producing. And this time, the experimentation went considerably further. The problem for Flotsam and Jetsam was that 1995 was a very different world from 1986. Thrash metal was no longer the center of the heavy music universe. The musical revolution of the early 1990s had changed everything. Metallica had gone mainstream. Pantera had transformed groove metal into a commercial force. Alternative metal was becoming increasingly important. Industrial influences were appearing everywhere. Grunge had changed the expectations of rock audiences. And bands that wanted to survive had a decision to make. Do you stay exactly where you came from, or do you change? Flotsam and Jetsam chose change. Drift incorporated elements of groove metal, alternative metal, and industrial music while moving further away from the fast, riff-driven thrash of their first two records. But what's important is that the band didn't completely abandon heaviness. They simply changed the way that heaviness worked. Instead of constantly relying on speed, Drift uses groove, atmosphere, and texture. The guitars are heavier and more deliberate. The rhythms have more weight. The arrangements are sometimes stranger and more unpredictable. There are moments where the band sounds almost uncomfortable with the conventional boundaries of metal. That was intentional. The official Flotsam and Jetsam site has described Drift as an album that was ahead of its time, particularly pointing to songs such as Empty Air and Missing as examples of the band's increasing maturity and willingness to move beyond conventional metal songwriting.
You can't see in here, but I know how.
The album opens with Me, and immediately we're hearing a different Flotsam and Jetsam. It's not the opening attack you might expect from a band responsible for Hammerhead or Iron Tears. Instead, the song feels introspective and psychologically uneasy. That darker, more personal atmosphere continues throughout the record. Empty Air is one of the album's strongest examples of the band's new direction. There's a sense of space in the arrangement, but the song still carries plenty of weight. Then comes Pick a Window, followed by 12-Year-Old with a thing I don't want to say on YouTube or else the video might get flagged. The song demonstrates another important change. Flotsam and Jetsam were becoming more serious in the subjects they were willing to address. Their lyrics weren't simply about metal cliches or fantasy anymore. They were tackling social problems, personal issues, and uncomfortable subjects. Then we get to Missing.
A black hole.
At nearly 6 minutes, it's one of the album's more ambitious tracks. This is where Drift starts making its case as something more than a band desperately trying to sound modern. It's a genuine songwriting ambition here. The band was trying to create atmosphere rather than simply aggression. Blindside and Remember brings some of the more familiar Flotsam elements back to the picture, particularly on the guitar side. Remember especially gives longtime fans something closer to the band's traditional riffing. Then the album takes another turn.
Stops. Don't make me spell it out. All I know is what I...
There was one song that demonstrates how far Flotsam and Jetsam had moved from the early sound that was Smoked Out. The song became a single in 1995 and a music video was produced for it. The official video remains available today through the band's official YouTube channel. Smoked Out is built around groove rather than thrash. It's slower, heavier, and more contemporary. And it contains one of the album's stranger moments, with Eric A.K. incorporating a spoken telephone service termination notice into the song. That kind of experimentation might seem normal today. In 1995, coming from a band with a reputation for technical thrash metal, it was a much bigger departure. The band wasn't trying to sound like Doomsday for Deceiver anymore. They were trying to sound like Flotsam and Jetsam in 1995, and that distinction is important. Drift produced 3 singles, although Smoked Out is the one that received the most obvious promotional push with the music video. But there was a problem. The traditional metal promotional infrastructure was disappearing. Headbangers Ball was no longer providing the same platform for heavy metal in the United States, while radio stations were increasingly changing formats. The bands that had once been able to build careers through metal radio or MTV suddenly had fewer places to reach an audience. So even if Flotsam and Jetsam were making a conscious effort to modernize, the environment wasn't necessarily there to reward them. And that brings us to the commercial story of Drift. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Drift did not sell as well as the band's previous albums. MCA had originally signed Flotsam and Jetsam with significant expectations. The label saw the potential for the band to become a major force in metal. But despite releasing several albums for the label, that breakthrough never happened, and Drift was the final chapter. The album's commercial performance was disappointing enough that Flotsam and Jetsam and MCA would part ways, ending their 6-year relationship. The band would eventually return to Metal Blade Records for their next album. There's something almost ironic about that. Flotsam and Jetsam had spent years trying to move forward. They changed the sound, they experimented, they became more mature, and commercially it didn't work. But that doesn't necessarily mean the album failed artistically. The critical response to Drift was mixed. One contemporary review in Lollipop magazine praised the album's crunchy guitar sound, strong vocals, and balance, while acknowledging that some elements of the band's presentation felt dated. Other reviews were much less enthusiastic. The Metal Archives currently lists 3 reviews with an average score of 68%, while Album of the Year lists a critic score of 60 and a user score of 62 based on its available ratings. And some retrospective reviews have been particularly critical of the album's departure from the band's classic sound. But here's where things get interesting. The fan response has aged differently. There are listeners who have now considered Drift one of the band's most underrated records. Recent fan discussions have included people calling it their favorite Flotsam and Jetsam album, while others describe it simply as an amazing or underrated record. That tells us something important. Drift may not have been the album Flotsam and Jetsam needed in 1995, but it may have been the album they needed to make. Because instead of pretending that 1986 was still happening, they acknowledged that the world had changed. And sometimes those albums age better than the albums that were designed to fit the moment.
In a dream, I've lost me in a dream.
By the time Drift was over, Flotsam and Jetsam had reached the end of their MCA story. They had released 3 albums for the label, and none had turned them into the next Metallica. Now they were once again without the support of a major label. For a band that has spent almost a decade trying to break through, it must have felt like another setback. But there was also an opportunity. The band had survived the collapse of the classic thrash era. They had survived lineup changes. They survived the departure of Jason Newsted. They had survived being signed to a major label and not achieving the expected commercial success. And now they were going back to where the story had started Metal Blade Records. In 1997, Flotsam and Jetsam would release their sixth album, High, and this time the musical direction would shift again. 2 years after Drift, Flotsam and Jetsam returned with High, released on June 3rd, 1997, and there is a fascinating story waiting for us there. Because after experimenting with groove, alternative, and industrial influence on Drift, the band would move back toward a more recognizable thrash and heavy metal sound. Check out the Flotsam and Jetsam playlist, which should be appearing on screen right now, and I will see you in the next one.